Last week we talked about John Hyrcanus briefly. I didn't do most of the talking. We had a guest lecturer, so to speak, who was actually a Messianic Jew who was talking about the Hasmonean dynasty. But we were talking last week about John Hyrcanus, who was the first real person who was considered one of the members of the Hasmonean dynasty. Before him, it had been the Maccabean Rebellion. The rebellion started by his grandfather, carried on by his father, as well as two of Mattathias' other sons. And that rebellion had ultimately been a successful rebellion, and John Hyrcanus came to take over Judea as the prince as well as the high priest, and reigned from 135 to 104. Yes?
I apologize if we were not here last week, but I've always wondered, the Maccabean Rebellion and the success of it, against whom did they rebel?
The Seleucid Empire, or Seleucid Empire, depending on which. The Greeks,
actually Greek Empire.
the Greeks, the central part of the Greek Empire that was left over after.
So this is all still pre-Roman domination.
Correct. Although the Romans we're not talking about the Romans too much yet, but the Romans are gradually dominating the world. They're just not. They haven't quite gotten to Judea yet. So we talked about John Hyrcanus, and kind of the last place that I left us before I turned it over to our guest speaker was, and the guest speaker was a video, just so you know, was by kind of comparing the relative territories. This was the territory that was controlled by Mattathias, who was John Hyrcanus' father. This was the territory that Hyrcanus controlled. So all of this is this green area here. All of the purple is what he added on to it. He essentially conquered Samaria, Edom, or Idumea is what it was called at that time, and a significant amount of territory on the Transjordan, which is the eastern side of the Jordan over there. So he was very successful. It took him a while to sort of get up to speed. He was unsuccessful initially, but he was very successful eventually. And so Hyrcanus ruled the Hasmonean dynasty, ruled over Judea from 135 until 104 BC. He also had the longest rule of pretty much anybody in the Hasmonean dynasty, or in the Maccabeans as well, in terms of just, he lived longer. So, so John's son was named Judah, but Judah didn't like his name, so he renamed himself Aristobulus I, which is, kind of more complicated. But the key is, Aristobulus was a Sadducee. He was by this time the Sadducees had become very much the pro-Greek, pro-Hellenistic party, whereas the Pharisees were the anti-Hellenistic party. And so by renaming himself Aristobulus, he made it pretty clear which side of the equation he was coming down. In John Hyrcanus' case, he kind of kept going back and forth between the two parties, depending on what he was trying to accomplish and which of them were more powerful at any given time. He kind of kept going back and forth. But Aristobulus made it clear right off the bat that he was going to be a Hellenizer. So he reigned a whole 1 year from 104 to 103. Now, up until this point, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, maybe last week, John Hyrcanus and those in the Maccabean family before him who had ruled had used the name Nasi, which means prince or president. They didn't use the term king. Now, they did call themselves high priests. They were all from the lineage of Aaron, so they had the right to do that, and they were the dominant priestly faction, although they were not the descendants of the guy Zadok the priest, who was the last of the line of Aaron that had included people like Abiathar and the other ones that if you go through it and read in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament, in the books of Samuel and Kings, the lineage of the primary high priest came through Abiathar down to Zadok. Zadok was the last of the high priests before the deportation of the Jews. The Hasmoneans were a different lineage from Aaron, but they were more successful, and because they still were qualified, they were naming themselves high priests. And for the most part, people weren't disagreeing with them based on their lineage. They were disagreeing with them based on their politics, and that's a different thing. Anyway, John Hyrcanus called himself prince. His son, Aristobulus, wasn't messing around. He called himself Basilius, which basically means king or emperor. So he was the first of the Hasmoneans to flat out call himself king and high priest as well, which did not sit very well with most of the Jews, especially not with the Pharisees and the common people, who felt like the kingship and the high priestship should be separate, and that the scriptures made it clear that those two things should be separate. Jerry?
Was Judah, his kingdom, pretty much independent at this point?
Yes.
Or were they still under the
Judea is functionally independent at this point. John Hyrcanus was able to set up an alliance with Rome that basically kind of made it a hands-off situation for the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, so the northern Greeks and the southern Greeks, neither one of them were really comfortable going up against Judea, not because they couldn't have won if they really tried to, but because they were, Rome was their ally, and more importantly, both of them were dealing with all sorts of civil wars and infighting and everything, and they didn't have any resources to expend trying to deal with Judea. So Judea was functionally
independent. Tribute to Rome or anyone?
They probably paid some money to get the original alliance, but they were not paying any sort of regular tribute. They were independent, very much like the kingdoms of David and Solomon and some of those early kings. They were independent. The big problem was that their kings were not from the line of David anymore, and so the Pharisees and others had a major problem with that, and they definitely had a problem with the notion of the high priest and the king being the same person when it came to this. So John Hyrcanus' son, Aristobulus, like I said, he lived for only 1 year. He got sick. He had some kind of stomach thing happen to him that made him increasingly sick. He was the oldest son of John Hyrcanus. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this. So John Hyrcanus originally, his plan was, he recognized that there was a lot of strife that was being caused by him being both prince and high priest. And so what he decided to do was to split that up within his own family, essentially. Now, the idea wasn't, we're going to bring in somebody totally different to do this, but his idea actually was that his wife would take over ruling the kingdom, and Aristobulus would become the high priest. Well, once Hyrcanus died, Aristobulus wanted no part of that, so he imprisoned his mother, as well as 3 of his 4 brothers in a prison somewhere, and starved. Well, he starved his mother to death, and he was gradually starving his brothers to death as well, and took over the kingship anyway. So basically, he ignored what his father wanted and took on both of those 2 rules. And I think that created even more animosity, because at the time he died, John Hyrcanus was pretty well liked even by the Pharisees, who by that time he'd gotten over to the Sadducee side. So Aristobulus lives for 1 year. Now, one brother of his, Antigonus I, also, he had originally had a Jewish name as well, but he decided to go Greek too. So Antigonus I was the one brother of Aristobulus that he actually liked and didn't actually throw in prison. And so it was, and I don't know that Antigonus was the second in line for the throne, but because all the other brothers were in prison, it was pretty likely that he was going to take over the throne when his brother died. The problem, or the issue, was that Aristobulus' wife, Salome Alexandra, didn't like this idea very much, because she knew that Antigonus did not like her, and she was very much concerned that when he took over, he would have her executed, or at least have her, stripped of her power, and maybe thrown in prison or whatever else. So Salome Alexandra came up with this fairly clever plan, and what she did is she convinced Antigonus that there were plots against him at the throne in Jerusalem. Not that Aristobulus was plotting against him, but there were plots against him, and so he needed to go around armed all the time. And then she convinced Aristobulus that Antigonus was looking to kill him and take over the throne. And Aristobulus was in a great deal of pain, and also under the effects of a variety of different medicines that probably were clouding his judgment anyway. And so he bought into that, and Antigonus bought into the idea that there was all these plots against him, or that there was all these threats against him. So Antigonus is walking around with a sword all the time, and Aristobulus is thinking he's trying to kill him. So this is kind of a bad combination. And so so not only did Salome convince Aristobulus that he's conspiring against him, but she also convinces him that he's done some things militarily to turn the troops away from Jerusalem against Aristobulus, and Antigonus is plotting against him to overthrow the government. So Antigonus, who had been gone from Jerusalem for a while, came back to the city, and he was summoned to go before Aristobulus, and Aristobulus didn't tell him why, because Salome had convinced him to kind of make it a surprise, but basically he was going to call him on the carpet to answer for what was going on with this supposed rebellion that he was stirring up. She also then convinced Antigonus to show up with his sword and armor bearer for this meeting. So Aristobulus is there waiting to talk to his brother about the possibility that he's a threat to him, and Antigonus comes into a meeting where everybody knows you're not supposed to have a weapon, but he's been convinced to bring his weapon with him, and his brother hasn't killed on the spot. So Aristobulus kills Antigonus before he can actually explain why this whole thing is going on. And the result is that when Aristobulus dies, Antigonus does not take over. Instead, Aristobulus' other brother named Jonathan, who of course also changed his, whoop, that was wrong, also changed his name to Alexander Jannaeus, which again, very Greek kind of a name. Salome had made a deal with Alexander Jannaeus that she would get rid of Antigonus in exchange for being able to marry him and have him take over the throne once Aristobulus died. So Aristobulus died, Antigonus had been killed before that, and because Salome had had no children for Aristobulus, under Jewish law, she was actually supposed to be married to Alexander Jannaeus, because the brother is supposed to marry the wife if there's no issue, so that there can be the preservation of the bloodlines. Well, this had nothing to do with that, except that it met Jewish criteria, but the result was that Salome becomes the queen for Alexander Jannaeus. And by this time, or by some time fairly early in his reign, his other couple of brothers have died. I think one of them starved to death in prison, another one died in a fairly, nondescript way, but they didn't really have a lot to do with this whole situation. So now the king is this guy, Alexander Jannaeus. Alexander Jannaeus is simultaneously highly successful as a king and expanding from the foreign affairs standpoint, and horrifically unsuccessful from the internal affairs standpoint. When it comes to the external affairs, this is the territory of John Hyrcanus. This is what we looked at a minute ago. This is what Alexander Jannaeus was able to do in expanding that territory. And if you can't really see it because the scales are different, so let me take this one down to the right scale, and now you can really see what Jannaeus was able to do. He essentially doubled the size of Judean territory over this course of time. And part of the reason he was able to do that is because by this time he was going northward, and northward was where the Seleucid Empire was. By this time the Seleucid Empire was in shambles. They were infighting. There were two different the descendants of two brothers were basically going back and forth, and no one really was in control. And the Romans kept meddling in their politics to make things more and more messy. And by this time, the Romans had already conquered about half of the Seleucid Empire. So the Seleucids were in no position to help anybody that he wanted to conquer. So he conquered the rest of Samaria, he conquered Galilee, he conquered north from there, and he also conquered south from there and took over the last of the Edomites' territory.
I have a comment and question. My
Okay.
comment is that this reminds me so much of the last few generations of the nation of Israel, and the intrigues and the assassinations and the mothers getting involved and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of crazy.
It just didn't take nearly as long to get there this time. Right. It took a lot of kings before that.
So my question is, what's the difference between the green and the purple on your maps?
So the green is the territory that's already possessed. The purple is the territory that's added to. In this case, the one thing that's a little bit deceptive is that actually this area right here was actually, what's his name? Antigonus. Aristobulus was in the process of conquering this territory before he died. Now, he didn't really finish the conquering, but they kind of award him kind of a, tie goes to the guy who started it kind of a thing. So so that's the difference, yes.
Are they getting closer tied in with Rome at this point?
Well, yes, because their alliance with Rome is a significant factor in why they're able to do this. There again, because it's kind of like the kid on the playground who has the big brother who can beat everybody up. That kid can get away with a lot because of his brother being there. And because of their alliance with Rome, the Seleucids, again, who haven't had a lot of ability to really do much to deal with it anyway, they are definitely not going to spend any capital or troops to try to go deal with the places that they're conquering that are mostly not Greek people. These are mostly native Edomites and Arabs and stuff like that. And so the Seleucids just, they don't have any effort to give for this. So it makes it easier. But it's still fairly remarkable that Alexander Jannaeus is able to have this kind of success. Okay, so I said he was successful when it came to the conquering, but not so much internally. Yes, sir?
I was going to ask, this map right here, how close is that to the time when
Pretty
Christ
close.
was born?
Oh, to Christ was born? Well, the lakes and the sea are all in the correct place, and everything else is controlled by Rome by the time Christ is born. Essentially, I'll break this down. So essentially, if you look at, that's not the right thing to do. There we go. So if you look at this map here, Galilee, which is controlled ostensibly as Jewish, is this area basically up here. Samaria is this central area here, and Judea is this lower section here. The Jews are in control, or they live in Judea, they live in Galilee. Samaria, of course, is settled by the Samaritans. Jews have kind of a narrow territory on the other side, which is how they get from one end of the country to the other. They cross over and go back in because they don't want to go into Samaritan territory. All of this is under the control of the Herods. The Herods, at one point there are 3 different Herods that control this area, this area, and this area. Later on, there's one guy that takes over all of it. But Rome is in control of all of it. None of it is the Roman governors and the Roman kings are the ones who control everything. So there's self-governance, but it's self-governance on a leash, basically. You know, you can do what you want to as long as you pay your taxes, don't have any riots, and don't do certain things. You can't execute people without our permission, things like that.
So they have occupational government too.
Yes, well, that's the thing. So you have Pilate from Rome, and you also have the Herods. The Herods, and actually hold off on that because the Herods, we'll talk about them in a second here. But yes, so you've got 2 different types of Rome, 2 different aspects of Rome. They're governors as well as the kings that they supported, who are now in control of this land. So, in terms of the territory that's Judea or Samaria, though, it's basically that green area on the map, the larger map. This green area is pretty much Galilee, Judea, and Samaria is that area. So, okay, so Alexander Jannaeus is, like I said, successful from a military standpoint, very unsuccessful internally, primarily because by this time the Pharisees are getting really upset about the Hellenization that's going on, as well as this idea that this guy Jannaeus is trying to be both high priest and king. They object to the king aspect because he's not from David's line. They object to the high priest aspect because he keeps wanting to add Greek things into the high priest's function. And so, and some of the things he does it just to irritate them. So on one of the feast days, when he's supposed to pour water out over the offering that's on the altar, he instead dumps it on his feet, not by accident, but on purpose, just to enrage the Jews, particularly the Pharisees. So he is not just disliked, he's hated by the Pharisees and by a lot of the common Jews, and he is increasingly the subject of a civil war. What happens is there's gradually a brewing civil war against him and against his rule. Initially, that is fought where the Pharisees are able to align themselves with sort of the last gasp of the Seleucid dynasty, who comes down to fight against them, at which point Alexander Jannaeus raises his big army of mercenaries and Jews and goes out and initially starts to lose, but then because it appears that more of the Jewish people have gone over to his side, the Seleucids decide they don't want any more of this and they leave, at which point the rebellion is crushed very easily. When that happens, Alexander Jannaeus slaughters a whole bunch of the Jews that are involved in the revolt, and then goes back to Jerusalem and invites 800 Pharisees to come to a supposed peace meal with him, and then crucifies all of them, while he and his concubines have a feast watching this happen in Jerusalem. He is routinely and roundly hated by the Jews, and particularly by the Pharisees, who they can't stand his very existence. But despite that, he does actually finish out his reign. He died, I believe he died relatively naturally. He fights some more battles and finally succumbs to death at a relatively reasonable age, considering all the things that were going on around him. When he dies, and this is interesting, his wife, Salome Alexandra, the one who did all the plotting and stuff before, she actually takes over the throne, and she reigns from 76 to 67. And what's particularly impressive, beyond just the fact that she's only the second woman to reign over Judah or Israel, and the first one, Athaliah, was technically just a regent, or regis, I don't know what the word is, for one of the sons of a king. She's the first and the only Jewish, or the only woman to reign outright as the queen. She's not the regent or the regis, she's not reigning until somebody gets old enough, she just is in charge. What she is able to do is to unify, or to not unify, but to pacify the Pharisees. So she takes a step back from the Hellenization that was going on. And when I talk about Hellenization, one of the major things that was happening during Alexander Jannaeus' reign is that, like I said, he kept trying to introduce Greek worship aspects into temple worship, but what he was also doing was putting up shrines to Greek gods at various places throughout the land. And so there was an increasing amount of Greek worship of Greek and Roman gods going on throughout Israel as he supported that more and more. Well, Salome Alexandra was actually the daughter of a Pharisee, a very prominent Pharisee, in fact. And so when she takes over, she doesn't immediately turn away from the Sadducees and put them under the thumb. What she does is she makes peace with the Pharisees. She starts to give them more input and more involvement. She gives them more seats on the Sanhedrin until they actually outnumber the Sadducees. And she does stop the construction of shrines and different things like that throughout the land. Now, she doesn't, I don't think she goes back and tears them all down, but she puts a stop to that so that the Hellenization is slowed down greatly under her reign.
What'd she do about the high priesthood?
So that's the very next thing here. She appoints her son, John Hyrcanus II, to the high priesthood. So he becomes high priest while she is the queen, and everybody's a lot more okay with that. The Pharisees are still not thrilled about the fact that the reign of the kingdom is not not from the line of David, but they're more okay with it, at least that it's being split between the high priest and one person, and the queen is somebody else different. So Hyrcanus is the high priest during her tenure as queen for about 9.5 years, something like that. When she dies, he takes over as king, which puts us right back in the same situation, although he was a little better liked by the Pharisees. You can guess from his name that he didn't go quite as far down the Hellenistic road as some of his brothers and other members of his family did. The problem is that he's not a very strong king. He's not a very decisive king. He's not a very smart king. And his brother Aristobulus II leads a rebellion against him, which is rapidly successful and kicks him off the throne after just 1 year on the throne. They have an ongoing battle for a period of time, or ongoing war, I should say, that culminates in the Battle of Jericho at 66 BC, when Hyrcanus is pretty much utterly defeated. Now, he runs back to Jerusalem and goes into the fortress in Jerusalem that the Greeks had built, but Aristobulus comes in and basically seizes the temple and all the rest of the city of Jerusalem and just says, you can stay up there and starve if you want to, or you can come down and we can have a reasonable peace. And fortunately for John Hyrcanus, he was actually a lot more reasonable than his father, Alexander, was, and he did actually enter into a peace with him that allowed them to put aside the hostility and basically continue to function.
Is that the same fortress where later the Romans would take Paul in that?
I don't know if it is or not. I think that's a different one because the Romans built their fortress right next to the temple, and this fortress was somewhere else in the city, I believe, anyway. So now, one of the things that Salome Alexandra had done to create some degree of peace between the Sadducees and the Pharisees was that because the Pharisees were kind of everywhere. I don't mean there were like so many of them, but they were in the towns, they were in the cities, they were in the countryside. She allowed the Sadducees to take control of a number of the fortified fortresses throughout Israel. So the Sadducees gradually came to control those in order to basically have a defense if the Pharisees and the common people who far outnumbered them decided to rise up or something. The Sadducees were more calm about that situation. And eventually those fortresses, I forget, I want to say Hyrcanus ends up going and living in one of those fortresses to stay away from his brother. A lot of what's going on here is also being driven by this guy named Antipater the Idumean, which Idumean is an Edomite, basically, a descendant of Edom. And Antipater is the court advisor. He actually starts off as the court advisor of, I want to say, Alexander Jannaeus. He may actually go all the way back to Aristobulus, but he's the court advisor for the Hasmoneans for a period of time, and he's very good. He's very smart. He's very cunning. He's probably part of the reason why they're so successful in terms of the territory they conquer. But he's also a bit of a schemer, and so he's probably very much involved in Salome Alexandra's schemes that ended up with one of her brothers-in-law being killed and the other one ascending the throne. He's very much involved in helping to create and foster the schism between John Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. He's just really involved in this whole thing and a big part of what's going on here. And that's significant because Antipater is actually the father of someone that we know very well in the New Testament, who's Herod the Great. Antipater is his father. We're going to talk a little bit more about him later, probably next week maybe. But anyway, during the civil war between John Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, Hyrcanus goes and tries to get this guy, Aretes III of Nabatea. Nabateans are a kingdom kind of to the north and to the east of Judea. He gets him involved in the fights between the two of them. And once he does that and he brings in this kind of larger army, Aristobulus II decides to contact Pompey, Rome, basically to contact Rome and say, look, you promised to be our allies, we're having this civil war, we need you to come and help out the legitimate king, who is me, Aristobulus. And so Hyrcanus immediately sends his own envoy to Rome and says, no, we need you to come and help out me because I'm the older brother and I'm the legitimate king. And the Pharisees send their own delegation to Rome and say, you know what, we don't like either of these guys, we'd like to just get rid of all of them. And so Pompey, who is a general, he's also a consul of Rome, he is one of the major leaders of Rome during this period of time. He will eventually align with Caesar and Marcus, forget the other guy's name right now, but whatever. He will align with Caesar and somebody else to form the triumvirate that rules Rome before Caesar takes over as the emperor. So Pompey is the guy Pompey's kind of in charge of foreign policy for the Roman Empire. So Pompey kind of actually leans toward Hyrcanus because he recognizes that Hyrcanus is going to be the easiest of all these guys to control because he's weak, because he's indecisive and whatever. So he sends his general Marcus Aemilius Scaurus to Judea to support, well, initially to support Hyrcanus, but once he gets there, by the time he gets there, the situation has kind of resolved itself. So when he gets there, instead, he basically says, I think we'll just take over. Because by this time, Rome had essentially conquered, or was in the process of conquering, the last of the Seleucid empires. So at this point, they have conquered 3 of the 4 Greek empires that were left over after Alexander the Great. They've conquered Macedonia, they've conquered Asia Minor, and now they've conquered the former Seleucid empire. So what was Syria, what was Babylon, all of that. They've conquered all of that. And so they're pretty much up to the edge of Judea at this point, and Pompey gets communications to Scaurus and says, you know what, just take over. So Scaurus takes over under Pompey, and very rapidly, unsurprisingly, defeats the Jewish mercenary and Judean army because they're no match for the Roman legions. And so Aristobulus II realizes that he's going to lose, and so he's ready to surrender the city. He's actually in a fortress called the Fortress of Alexandretta, I believe, that's a little ways away from Jerusalem. The Romans lay siege to it. It's obvious he's going to lose, so he runs back to Jerusalem and basically says, open the gates and let them in. And the people in Jerusalem say, we're not opening the gates. You're not the king anymore. We're going to take you seriously. We're going to keep the gates closed and we're going to hold out this siege, which leads to the siege of Jerusalem in 63 BC. And that went just about as well. No, actually it went a lot better than the siege of Jerusalem in 72 AD, because in this case they're not looking to wipe the Jews out completely. What ends up happening, though, is that Pompey's armies have to tear down most of the walls of Jerusalem, which ends up doing a lot of damage to the temple as well because of the proximity of the temple to the walls of Jerusalem. But eventually they're able to break through the walls of Jerusalem. They take Aristobulus II captive, even though ironically he was the one guy who wanted to open the walls. And they end up opening the gates, and they end up killing a lot of the Jews and stuff like that. But they are now in control of Jerusalem, and functionally in control of Judea. So 63 BC is the end of the Hasmonean Empire as a functional independent republic, and not republic, functional independent government, and now the Romans are in control. So we are now getting much closer to the time of Christ, because the Romans are now in control. Now we're going to talk about how that control evolves next week, but what I want to finish by talking about here is the social, cultural, economic stuff that we take a look at the end of each of the sections. So this is probably, outside of maybe the Roman era, the period of time where the most major developments that get us from the Old Testament to the New Testament happen. One of the things that happens is that the Jewish canon is formalized, and when we use the word canon with only one in the middle, we're not talking about artillery pieces, we're talking about the set of books or written documents that are accepted as legitimate for the Old Testament, or what the Jews would call the Bible, essentially. And so the Jewish canon is pretty much formalized during the Hasmonean period. Now, they're depending on which historians believe there may be still some additional stuff that's added to finalize it, even through the 1st and 2nd century AD. But for the most part, there's pretty broad agreement that the Jewish the Testament is completed. Second thing that happens during this period of time is the Septuagint is completed. Anybody know what the Septuagint is? Somebody tell me.
Old Testament in Greek.
Okay, this is pretty huge because the Old Testament has only ever been in Hebrew before that, maybe in Aramaic, some parts of it. But the Septuagint translates the Old Testament into Greek. And almost everybody in the Roman world speaks Greek and reads Greek. And so this is a huge thing because it actually makes it possible for the average person to read the Old Testament.
Dramatic as what's his name put print in the first part.
It really is.
Who was that guy? Gutenberg?
Yeah, Gutenberg's press. So this is huge because, and this is huge both from an immediate sense because this now means that Jews who can't even read Hebrew anymore, which is a lot of them, who can read Greek can now read the Old Testament. But it really becomes huge when the church is founded because now you have people, many of whom are not native Jews, many of whom are not Hebrew readers or anything else, who have access to the Old Testament scriptures, which at the time were the only scriptures that were around, that they can read in Greek and they can understand the basis, the beginnings of the gospel that they now believe in. So this is kind of a huge thing. Next thing, yes, sorry, go ahead.
And this kind of thing is the way you can see the hand of God shaping things to set up the spread of the kingdom.
Yes.
You know, Paul kind of brings all of it together, but having a Greek version of the Bible made it much easier
Yes.
for God's message to spread throughout the entire Roman Empire.
Yeah.
It seems ironic because their language is Latin, but as you say, Greek was the language of the world
Right.
for quite some time after.
Well, and the Romans used Latin for official stuff, but the Romans spoke Greek, and the Romans wrote in Greek for everything else, because they liked Greek. So, Jerry?
No.
Oh, sorry, okay. So, next major Greek thing is the ascendancy of the Sanhedrin. We talked about the Sanhedrin. We've got its foundational existence back in the previous couple of centuries before this. But what happens during the Hasmonean period is the Sanhedrin becomes pretty important. Not only do they become sort of the central, and there's two concepts of Sanhedrin. There's the greater Sanhedrin, which is in Jerusalem. It is the leading Pharisees and Sadducees that are together to make decisions about things. There are lesser Sanhedrins in many of the larger towns throughout Israel that make decisions on less important stuff. It's kind of like in the Old Testament, if you look at the Jewish law, there's the notion if you have an issue, you should go to the local Levites and ask them, and if they can't solve it, you go to the high priest, and the high priest figures it out. So that's kind of what's happening here. The Sanhedrin becomes a political body, so they're not just a court, they are also a body that the kings of the Hasmoneans end up going to them for assent in some of the things that they want to do, for permission, to get their advice, different things like that. So Sanhedrin becomes quite powerful by the end of the Hasmonean period. And they are made up of a combination of Sadducees and Pharisees. Now, this isn't like the U.S. House of Representatives or something where they're voted in or whatever. It's really more a matter of kind of who's recognized as being the leaders by the kings, by other groups of people like that, which is why during Salome Alexander's reign, the composition of the Sanhedrin changed and went from being Sadducee majority to Pharisee majority. And so the Pharisees became more important or more numerous.
When the Romans got in about 63 then BC, there never was a Jewish king set up, or nothing recognized at that point. It turned more to the political
Well, no, up to
side
that
of the
point there had been
Sanhedrin.
Hasmonean kings. So there had been Hyrcanus and his descendants who'd been kings, but once the Romans took over, the kings that are set up are actually Edomite kings who are Jewish converts, and they get set up as the kings officially by the Romans.
They were set up, so there was a king as well.
Right.
And,
That's Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the first of the major kings of Judea after the Romans take over.
All right, now I got it.
Okay, so the Sanhedrin becomes increasingly important, and then of course we have the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, the Sadducees have been around for longer than the Pharisees. They began all the way back in before even the Greek period of time, because they were the people that were increasingly associated with the temple worship and with the priesthood and different things like that. The Pharisees came about as a reaction to the Sadducees more than anything else. They were extremely anti-Hellenization. They felt like there had been a major turning away from the law and from what God wanted by the Sadducees and by those who were in charge of the temple. They didn't like the notion of the kings being the same as and the same family being the kings and the high priests. They had a lot of issues. And more broadly, they were just troubled and deeply concerned by the proliferation of idols and Greek forms of worship that were happening in the land. They felt like this is just, it's a replication of the same things that got us sent into captivity in the first place. So the Pharisees were very quickly, or in a very short period of time, became direct opponents of the Sadducees. Now last week, the guy who was doing the video, showed a slide that I want us to take a look at here. So he goes through it and he's talking about kind of the way that the kingdom was set up. So prior to the Maccabean revolt, you had a group of people, the Onaids. The family was the Onaids. They were mostly faithful priests. They were the people that were kind of set on the path by Ezra and Nehemiah to be the priests in the land, and they were kind of in charge. Over time, the priests became friends with a new class of people that came about who were scholars, the people, as he talked about, who were in Babylon, and who in Babylon, when they didn't have a lot of written stuff, and they didn't have a temple, they didn't have those things, people who knew the law the best, remembered it the best, were the ones who were teaching in Babylon. And they were the scholars who, when they came back into the land, they came back to the land as well, and they were the ones who knew the law best, because they were the ones who'd been teaching it. So they're still all friends. Well, the priests eventually are taken over by the Maccabees. The Maccabees become the new set of priests, and they are still friends with the Hasidim, who are the descendants of the scholars, who are people who are, they are religious, they're knowledgeable about religion, they're knowledgeable about the law, and they are also taking part in the Maccabean revolt. They're the foot soldiers of the Maccabeans, essentially. But then this transitions, and what happens is now the Maccabees transition into the Hasmoneans, who are very Hellenistic, as well as aristocrats, as well as the priests, and they have a lot of strife with the descendants of the Hasidim, who are the scribes, the teachers, the religious laymen, the people who know the law and know the traditions, and who are seeing that what the Hasmoneans and the aristocrats and the priests are doing is increasingly divorced from those law and traditions. And so eventually this transitions to enmity. The Sadducees are on one side, they kind of, the Hasmoneans, the aristocrats, the priests are part of the Sadducee party, the scribes, the teachers, the rabbis, the religious laymen, they've become the Pharisees, and they are either outright or ideologically at war on a pretty regular basis. And so what we see happening during this period of time is that the Sadducees and Pharisees are disputing each other, and one of the major aspects of that dispute is the Talmud. And I'm just about to wrap this up. I know we're running a little bit over, but I want to finish this. The Talmud is the oral tradition of the Jews. This is what the scholar last week was talking about, where essentially you had a group of Jews from Babylon on who started having to answer questions about how to live in a world that didn't look very much like the world that the Jews were originally supposed to live in, the Israelites were supposed to live in when they went into the Promised Land. And as they got those questions asked of them, they started coming up with answers. But when somebody would say, well, where did you get that answer from? They kind of had to make up this story, this idea that where they got that answer from was that God had given Moses some additional information that wasn't written down at Mount Sinai, but instead he had just told it to him orally. And that Moses had then passed that on orally. It had never been written down until during the Hasmonean period when they started writing it down. What was really happening is they just started making it up during the Babylonian period, and they just started writing it down basically once they got more and more questions. So the Talmud was the oral tradition. It eventually became a written tradition, but it was basically all the different additional rules and regulations you had to follow. And when you go through the New Testament and see Jesus talking about, you make up rules, you make up regulations. This is what he's talking about. That's right. This is what he's talking about. This is something that modern day rabbinical Jews believe is just as important, if not more so, than the Torah. And that is one of the major areas in which rabbinical Judaism, or modern day Orthodox Judaism, is fundamentally incompatible with modern day Christianity. Because Christianity does not accept the notion that there's just a bunch of hearsay that got passed down and finally written out so everybody could see it. And neither do the Messianic Jews, which is what the guy was here last week. He believes that the oral tradition was wrong. Now, he doesn't agree with the Pharisees or the Sadducees and what they believe, but he believes that the oral tradition was made up. and that in fact the Torah and the other accepted books of the Jewish canon are what is supposed to be followed and listened to, and that they're the ones that foretell the coming of the Messiah, who he believes is Jesus. Now, he has some different ideas about exactly how that's going to work out, a lot closer to what we would think of as premillennialism than we do, but in terms of the core of what he's believing, it's a lot closer to Christianity. It is Christianity, it's just Christianity that looks a little bit more like I said, premillennialism. But there's all of this disagreement with the Sadducees and Pharisees, and because of that, a third group, the Essenes, basically say, you know what, we don't want anything to do with anything. So we're just going to shut this down. We're going to go live lives of asceticism. We're going to live in our communities. We're going to do good tonight to poor people. We're going to get rid of our possessions for the most part. We're going to basically try to live righteous lives without getting in the middle of all this other stuff. And the Essenes live within in many of the major cities and towns within Judah, or Judea, but the most important place that they lived was in Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The Essenes were the ones who were responsible for collecting the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was essentially their library. That's what at least most scholars believe. And the Essenes, therefore, are the ones who contributed maybe more in a single brute force moment through the Dead Sea Scrolls than any other group of people throughout all of history have contributed to the scriptures in terms of actual documents. The Essenes were responsible for doing it. And then finally, the last thing we see is the rise of Herodians. I mentioned the fact that Antipater is the father of Herod the Great, and he is scheming all along in this process to put his son on the throne once the Romans get in there. And so we'll talk next week about the Romans. That's the last of our sections in here. We're going to talk about the Romans, the rise of the Roman Empire, briefly, because the rise of the Roman Empire is like a 3-month-long doctorate level history class. And then we're going to talk about how the Romans came to control Judea and lead us up right to the time of Christ. So, thank you for your patience. Like I said, I know we ran a little over. We're going to stop now. Any questions? I know I went really fast at the end there. Any questions? If you have a question that you want to ask, but you don't want to ask because it's too late in the day, wait until next week and ask me at the beginning of class and we'll talk about this. Thank you, guys.